Sir, in moving that this bill be now read a third time, I'd like to make a brief contribution on that third reading. I was intending to say some of these things at the end of the second reading debate, but in the House's, and I'm grateful to the House for doing so in their will to move things along as quickly as possible. We could last week. I missed out on that opportunity. So, both on my own behalf and the behalf of the Minister for Health, I wish to thank the members who have spoken on and supported this bill, and indeed it is a major milestone in the history of the Parliament by establishing the first ever legislation to prevent suicide in South Australia, and indeed the first in legislation of this type in Australia. The legislation will dramatically change the reach of suicide prevention action across the state by establishing a whole-of-government and whole-of-community approach. It will establish a systems approach that will help and enable us to drive down the rate of suicide by effective prevention, as well as provide improved support and care to people with lived experience of suicide, including their families and friends. The immediate next steps with the passage of this important legislation will be to establish the Suicide Prevention Council, legislated in its now form, the development of the next state suicide prevention plan, and to establish any regulations that may be required. And I'm sure that we're all looking forward to this legislation commencing as soon as possible. I'd like to thank all those people who provided a response during the consultation phase on the bill and their strong support for this legislation. Many people with lived experience of suicide spoke openly about their experiences and supported this legislation, seeing it as a much-needed measure to improve the prevention of suicide and the responses of our service agencies following the suicide of a loved one. I note and recognise and appreciate the work of the former advocates, the Honourable John Dawkins and the Honourable Dan Cregan, for their work in this area, and I know certainly the Premier is very appreciative of his own role now in pursuing the work on a more personal front. The development of this legislation has been important, and many people have worked towards it. I'd like to thank members of the Premier's Suicide Prevention Council who have wholeheartedly supported the introduction of the legislation and worked to ensure that the best legislation possible, noting that South Australia are trailblazers in this field. Finally, I'd like to thank the officers who have supported the development of the legislation, particularly Ms Kay Anastasiadis of the Office of the Chief Psychiatrist, as well as, of course, Dr John Brayley, the Chief Psychiatrist, who have both provided me with support today in the bill, and I'd like to thank the Shadow Minister for Health in assisting us with the speedy passage through the committee stage today. I'd like to thank Ms Lynn Dean, the Chief Executive of Wellbeing SA, Professor Katina Denise, the Executive Director of Prevention and Population Health at Wellbeing SA, the staff of their offices, and indeed the suicide prevention team in Wellbeing SA. It would be remiss of me not to reflect that the member for Heiston and I were discussing the recent forum in his electorate that I think Justina Rosa from that team chaired, and the great way that the Wellbeing SA team were able to interact with the stakeholders and the community members who were in attendance on that night, and how much those community members appreciated that work, and also Mark Herbston, Parliamentary Counsel, all of the other public servants who have been involved in the debate, and all of those who have contributed to the second reading debate today. The second reading debate prior to today.